Under a searing Arizona sun, a lion who hadn't walked free in 7 years staggered toward the man who had cut his chains, and then did something no one expected. With hundreds watching, the 400-pound beast collapsed at his rescuer's feet, begging for affection. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. First, let's go back to the beginning. The first time Daniel stepped onto the circus grounds, the air was thick with the stench of decay and old straw. Rusted rides leaned like dying skeletons against the blazing blue sky, their colors faded to ghostly pastels. Weeds clawed through cracked asphalt, and the silence was punctuated only by the lonely creak of a tattered banner snapping weakly in the wind. But it was the lion's pen that drew Daniel's full attention, and it made his blood run cold. Solomon lay motionless against the scorched concrete wall, little more than a heap of battered fur and bone. The chain that shackled him was grotesquely tight, crusted with old blood where it had bitten into his skin. His ribs jutted sharply under his hide, and patches of fur had been rubbed raw from years of pacing in the same endless, hopeless circles. When Daniel's shadow fell across the pen, Solomon didn't even lift his head. There was no growl, no roar, only the slow, broken rise and fall of his breath. Daniel gripped the chain-link fence so hard the metal bit into his palms. How many years had Solomon endured this hell? How many nights had passed, with the lion watching the stars from behind bars, feeling the desert chill seep into his bones? Rage burned in Daniel's chest, hotter than the Arizona sun, and yet he knew anger alone wasn't enough. Solomon needed action. He needed someone to fight for him. The old circus manager emerged from a nearby shack, limping heavily, his face craggy with sun and time. He barely glanced at Solomon as he shuffled closer, muttering about damn bleeding hearts and government busybodies. Daniel barely heard him. His eyes were locked on Solomon, on the way the lion shifted, just slightly, as if feeling some faint spark of hope he didn't dare believe in. There was something sacred in that battered creature's resilience, something that demanded more than pity. It demanded a promise. Daniel knelt in the dust and pressed his forehead lightly to the fence, closing his eyes. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't a lawyer, but he knew chains when he saw them, and he knew how to break them. Behind him, the desert wind kicked up, carrying the scent of sage and sand through the broken grounds. In that moment, Daniel swore silently to Solomon and to himself. This lion would not die in chains, not if he could stop it. The weeks leading up to that moment had been a brutal test of endurance. Every meeting with the circus owners was a sickening parade of excuses and veiled threats. "It's private property," they sneered. "You touch that lion, you're trespassing." Their eyes gleamed with a kind of casual cruelty, seeing in Solomon's misery nothing but potential profit. A sideshow relic to be sold to another roadside zoo, another chain, another cage. Daniel wasn't naive. He knew saving Solomon meant battling a system that valued greed over dignity. He called in every favor he could, summoned reporters with hidden cameras, flooded the local press with heartbreaking images. He stood outside courthouses holding signs in the blistering sun, faced jeering crowds who called him a fool. At night, he lay awake, haunted by the sight of Solomon's quiet suffering, feeling the unbearable weight of urgency clawing at his soul. And yet, Solomon waited. Day after day, as Daniel fought legal loopholes and bureaucratic indifference, the lion simply waited. Not roaring, not fighting, but enduring, as if he had learned long ago that rage would only tighten the chains. His amber eyes, dulled by despair, never stopped following Daniel across the yard, a silent anchor tying their fates together. The final approval came quietly, just a terse email from a court clerk granting permission to remove Solomon from the premises. No celebration, no crowd. Just Daniel, a battered set of bolt cutters, and a world holding its breath. The chain resisted at first, old and rusted but stubborn. Daniel's hands shook from more than just effort. It was the gravity of the moment, the realization that he was cutting through more than metal. He was severing years of cruelty, snapping a link forged by neglect, humiliation, and fear. When the chain finally gave, it fell with a dull, metallic thud onto the cracked cement. The sound echoed off the abandoned tents and peeling trailers like a death knell for the life Solomon had known. For a long heartbeat, neither man nor lion moved. The air itself seemed to freeze. Then Solomon shifted, muscles trembling from disuse, and stumbled forward. His great head drooped low, and he collapsed. Not from weakness, but from something deeper. A lifetime of chains suddenly, impossibly gone. His massive body leaned into Daniel's kneeling form with a weight that wasn't just physical. Daniel's fingers sank into Solomon's matted mane, tears streaking down his dust-smeared face. He held the lion the way a man holds a miracle, gently, reverently, knowing he was cradling something fragile and sacred, a broken heart that somehow still chose to believe in kindness. The first days at the rehabilitation center were brutal to watch. Solomon, once a creature made to rule the plains, struggled even to stand without trembling. Each step was a fragile, clumsy effort, his limbs betraying the proud strength they had once held. The center staff, though experienced with rescues, moved with heartbreaking gentleness around him, never shouting, never rushing, treating him less like a patient and more like a sacred relic of something the world had almost lost. Veterinarians cleaned his wounds with careful hands, murmuring soft reassurances that Solomon likely didn't understand, but somehow seemed to sense. Antibiotics began to work on the infections festering beneath his matted mane. Special nutrient-rich meals helped put meat back on his emaciated frame. But it was his mind, not just his body, that needed healing. And that was where Daniel's role became irreplaceable. Daniel came every single morning, rain or shine, a silent, steadfast figure just beyond the fence line. He never pushed, never coaxed too hard. He brought offerings of raw steaks, thick rope toys, and sometimes simply sat cross-legged in the grass, reading aloud from battered old books about African savannas and wild skies. Solomon, at first, ignored him entirely, staring past him at something invisible, something lost. But patience, like water on stone, eventually began to leave its mark. One morning, as Daniel read softly from a book of poetry, Solomon shifted. Not much, just the flick of an ear, the briefest narrowing of his golden eyes toward the sound. Another day, when Daniel tossed a heavy ball into the enclosure, Solomon watched it roll, his head tilting in slow, almost puzzled curiosity. A week later, when Daniel crouched low by the fence and called his name, Solomon lifted his great, scarred head and, for the first time, acknowledged him with a slow blink, the ancient lion's way of saying, "I see you." The first rumble of a purr, faint but unmistakable, came 2 weeks later when Daniel leaned in with a long-handled brush and began working through the mats in Solomon's mane. The sound vibrated low through the ground, so unexpected it nearly broke Daniel's composure. Solomon stretched one massive paw toward him, not aggressively, not in warning, but with a slow, almost childlike curiosity, batting at the hem of Daniel's shirt. In those tiny moments, those flickers of trust and slow, halting rediscovery, Daniel saw the rebirth of a soul. Freedom wasn't about wide-open spaces or the absence of chains alone. It was about daring to hope again. And every day Solomon dared a little more. The air inside the sanctuary enclosure was electric, trembling with a tension that no one dared speak aloud. Cameras clicked nervously, capturing the first moments of what could either be a triumph or a tragedy. Daniel Hayes stood still at the center, his hands relaxed at his sides, his breathing measured, though his heart thundered in his chest. He knew Solomon better than anyone now, but instinct reminded him that even the deepest bond could not erase the wildness that lived in a lion's blood. Solomon emerged slowly from the shaded grove of trees at the far end of the enclosure, his golden coat glinting under the afternoon sun. His gait was steady now, muscles rippling with restored strength, but his eyes held the true miracle. They were no longer hollow or dulled by years of suffering. They burned, steady and alive, carrying a soul that had chosen trust over fear. The sanctuary workers held their breath as Solomon padded closer, every heavy step kicking up tiny clouds of dust. Daniel did not move. He resisted every urge to reach out first. This moment, if it was to happen, had to come from Solomon's own will. And it did, with a low rumble deep in his chest, a sound so rich it seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. Solomon leaned forward and pressed the broad weight of his forehead into Daniel's chest. It was a slow, deliberate nudge, not born of aggression, but of recognition, of belonging. The lion stood like that for a long moment, as if memorizing the feel of the man who had torn his chains away, who had sat with him through every silent, broken night. Then Solomon gave a great, shuddering sigh and lowered himself onto the ground, rolling his vast frame onto his side at Daniel's feet, his paws curled toward the sky, his thick belly exposed in an unmistakable gesture of vulnerability, a predator's ultimate act of trust. From behind the sanctuary fence, a sob broke free, then another. Reporters lowered their cameras, some wiping at their faces. Volunteers clutched each other's hands, barely believing what they were witnessing. Daniel knelt slowly, running his hands through the thick fur of Solomon's mane. Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't need to see clearly to understand. No words could capture the enormity of this moment. A shattered creature, once left to rot behind steel and cruelty, offering up the purest, most sacred gift a wild heart could give: forgiveness. And in that sacred clearing under the open sky, man and lion healed together, bound by something fiercer and stronger than any chain. Something no cruelty could ever take away again. The world had seen miracles before, but few as raw, as wrenchingly beautiful as Solomon's. Within days, Daniel's simple photos, the battered man crouched beside the enormous lion who leaned into him like a long-lost brother, had circled the globe. Newscasters called it the bond that broke a nation's heart. Animal rights organizations hailed it as proof that redemption was not a fairy tale, but a force woven into the fabric of survival itself. But for Daniel, none of the headlines mattered. He spent most days quietly at the sanctuary, far from the noise of flashing cameras and swelling social media feeds. The world saw a hero. He saw a survivor who had taught him something he had never learned on any battlefield. Freedom wasn't just about breaking locks or tearing down fences. Freedom lived in the choice to reach out, battered, bruised, half-broken, and trust again. Solomon's trust wasn't given lightly. Daniel had earned it day by slow, agonizing day, kneeling in the dirt, speaking softly into the silences, never demanding, only offering. In that sacred transaction, Daniel had discovered something far more profound than any victory parade could offer. He wasn't just rescuing Solomon. In some secret, essential way, Solomon had been rescuing him. Now, as the late afternoon sun slanted golden across the sanctuary grounds, Daniel ran his hand through Solomon's thick, slowly healing mane. The lion rumbled in contentment, a deep vibration that seemed to anchor them both to the earth itself. Around them, life flourished, trees rustling in the soft breeze, birds calling overhead, the scent of fresh grass curling through the air. This was no fairy tale. Scars still marred Solomon's body, faint reminders of every year stolen from him. But the scars no longer defined him. They were simply part of the story, like old knots in a great oak tree, evidence of storms weathered and survived. Looking into Solomon's steady, amber gaze, Daniel felt a fierce, reverent gratitude bloom in his chest. The world could call it a miracle if it needed to. He knew better. It was a covenant, a bond forged not in triumph, but in pain endured, chains broken, and forgiveness given freely when it had every reason to be withheld. And maybe that was the real miracle. Not just that Solomon had been freed, but that he had chosen, against every scar, against every betrayal, to love again. And in doing so, he had taught a broken world that healing was always possible.